No, I mentioned that as a child, I wanted to grow up too fast. I wanted to be an adult. And that kind of gets to the I don't know why I wanted to, other than I thought that it was something, that being an adult was some mythical, amazing thing. And I think too often we get caught up in this perceived growth and where it leads us to being something better than where we are. When there are times now that while I don't want to be a child, I would love to go back to that purity and enjoyment, the mystery, all those feelings that I left so quickly behind at the expense of trying to be an adult when I wasn't one. Telltale Games, we have to ask ourselves, when the opportunity came with the growth that followed The Walking Dead in 2012, what were the motivations beyond just earnings? What were you trying to accomplish? You grew a team, you put out more games, but other than just doing it because you could, did you ask that should you? What was that path? Where was it leading to? The whys really do matter here.
Right. So what's interesting here is we see, I think, really a subtle shift that occurs. With Walking Dead, we see this phenomenal game coming out. It was really, at that point in time, it was the apex of their storytelling, their ability to deliver a fun game experience and a really engaging story. But with that acumen came a price. This became this drive to deliver and to deliver and to deliver. And I think that's where the issue comes in. Ed Catmull, who was formerly the president at Pixar, he wrote a book called Creativity Inc. And he really describes what happens to Telltale verbatim with his experience while working at Pixar, observing Disney in the animation studio. He talks about during the late 80s, early 90s, when Disney is starting to hit their stride again with animated films. First coming out with The Little Mermaid, and then the following ones, success after success. But what he saw is that the studio, in order to meet this demand, in order to keep on delivering these new movies, these great experiences, they grew their studio, and they grew and they grew and they kept growing. And what he calls this the beast. The beast is this desire to continually progress. It's this desire to what happens is it's also a glutton. It's a glutton for success. It wants to succeed. And what happens is because the focus becomes so much on delivering, you lose focus on what's truly important. And for Telltale, it's to make great games.
One, I think a lot of us kind of identify with there's a lot of monsters when you're creative that you're feeding. There's the ones that revolve around self-doubt that we'll definitely not want to get into right now. But there's that feeling of dread knowing that no matter how much success you have, whether it be small or large, that you will never, ever be able to feed this monster. That there's something in us that a lot of, whether it be me or any other creative that I've engaged with, a lot of us fear the realization that we can't be happy. And I don't buy into that granted, I don't buy into that even though I'm a victim to it. It's the reality that we have to take those moments to know our why. Telltale, I think, lost track of that why from both a leadership and a company level. What they wanted to do to make these good games and have these experiences so that they can enjoy those small moments to fuel them beyond and help them circumvent this beast, to feed it so that it can pull them forward without blocking their path.
That's an important point to make, is that Telltale growing, that wasn't a mistake. That was an act of choice. And then not necessarily the wrong choice either. What it goes back to is really understanding that why. Is why are you growing, or why are you putting out these games? And what we see is a shift in understanding their why, a shift from making great games with great experiences to simply getting the game out the door. Now, there's still so much love and passion in these games, their ability to tell stories, but what happens, because the beast is so demanding, it's got such a hunger for more and for more, is it doesn't allow for innovation to bloom, to foster. And that's the important contrast that Ed Catmull makes in his book. He talks about there's the beast, there's also the ugly baby. The ugly baby is those gems of ideas, these creative innovations that start really crude and they're vulnerable, and you have to allow the space and the time to develop and to grow them. The beast, if it comes out of hand, it won't let room for that baby to grow. So you have to find the balance. The beast is the motivator, but it'll also devour you. The baby is the birth of innovation, but unless you deliver and you foster that growth, it won't amount to anything. And so there's a balance between the two.
Like any resource, there's only so much we can feed any one thing. So if you're putting it all towards the beast, there's only limited room in that refrigerator, and eventually that ugly baby will starve. So you are starving out the most beautiful parts of creativity. The beast drives it, but it's turning that ugly baby into something beautiful, allowing it to be released out into the world and being able to have the energy and the ability to keep feeding into that, so that the line between the beast and the baby is really blurred versus the beast being so dominant.
And that's really the lesson to be learned from this, is Telltale became trapped by their own success. Their drive to produce more and more, that desire, as you mentioned, to capture lightning in a bottle, that couldn't be sustained unless you allow room to foster the growth of that baby. And that's what we see within these games. Is they're the same experiences over and over. Great stories, but the same game mechanics, which led to what was originally with The Walking Dead an incredible experience. It dulls over time. And so their drive to produce games, again, was the wrong motivating factor. It has to always be on value, on quality.
No, I think it's interesting you mentioned the beast trapped in a cage, because the way I envision this is I imagine the baby in there with them. And when you feed that beast enough, it won't devour that baby. It won't eat that baby, but you also have to leave enough room for that baby to grow. They're sharing and occupying this space at the same time. The cage is a gift. The cage is the parameters and the boundaries that we have to work in. As a creative, we need these so that we don't run wild and actually can make things. But the difference being is while they have to cohabitate, they need to be able to serve one another and not to have that baby being something strong enough to devour the beast instead. That's actually even more damaging, in my opinion, than the beast itself. Or it's actually equally as damaging as the beast itself, because the beast is a necessary component of what drives us. So if we only have ideas and we don't have the drive to bring them into life, that's as big a problem as having all drive and no vision.
Right. And again, it's all about balance. And that's, I think, the really interesting theme you'll see throughout all of these many lessons we start pulling out, is there's always a balance between the two. Focus solely on the drive, the production, then you truthfully stop growing, you stop innovating. If you only focus on the ideas, you don't make anything. And so it's the culmination of the beast and the baby coming together, finding that perfect balance, so that way you can move forward, but also allow those creative ideas to flourish.
When we come back to pacing, stories are all about pacing, but it's also about identifying those important characters and characteristics, the beast, the baby, and how they drive this story along.
An important aspect of this isn't unique to Telltale. This happens across many businesses, across many industries. When the focus becomes on production over value, you lose sight of what's truly important. And so this is, right, hindsight's 2020. This is like the saying goes, that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, this pattern had been seen before, but it's difficult to see even now. I'm not saying that when Telltale was producing these games, I had the mind to say, they're falling into this trap. No way. I saw that they were producing great game after great game, and I thought they were at the height of their success, or even haven't even reached their height. You're going to keep on going. But the fact of the matter is there was that shift in what was truly important, and unfortunately, it became their trap. Their drive to produce game after game became their trap, and the trap that it would eventually, unfortunately, end them.
Right, when you find yourself in a trap without escape, eventually you will starve. Something has to give. As we've talked about, success is a gift and a curse. It's something that can lift you, or it's something that can smother you. The important thing was why you do these things, the choices. We talk about perception versus reality. From the outside looking in, without looking at financials, if you're just a consumer, you think more games equals more success, because who would make so many games without thriving? But that comes back to the why. Delivering what really matters. One game at a time, 2 games at a time would have probably meant more. There wouldn't have been as much crunch. There's more value in how that affects things internally, versus also, why did you need 3 instead of 2? Why? What does it bring you? Would you be happier making one game that you really wanted, 2 maybe, instead of 3 that didn't quite deliver? Even if things were as great as they ended up being in a lot of ways, the ability to find that value, to not, as a creative, not stagnate. What about the whys of all the people within the company that wanted more, that voiced that and didn't get answered? And being able to attend to those with greater agility, instead of trying to stretch this thing so thin that it was unrecognizable at some points for people who worked there. I mean, it's still the same thing, just so much more transparent. It didn't have the same integrity to hold up against not being torn. When you pull something that much, eventually it has to fray somewhere. And eventually, when they were able to start mending those things, the too much too fast led to too little too late.
Right. Growth for the sake of growth should never be the priority, especially if you don't have the framework, the structure in place in order to still foster those young ideas, those innovations, so that they can grow and mature and allow your company to innovate and pivot and shift. It's part of the reason why Pixar is still around today, is they've allowed that room for those types of gems to be born, to grow, to be refined, and take shape in the movies we watch for them today. If you're growing without having that balance of being able to deliver and that balance of being able to innovate, is you're playing a short game.
Planning for success is at the crux of this. So as I said previously, there are paths and crossroads at any juncture of the creative process or business process for that matter. And the issue being, and I keep coming to this, is that idea of that path, the one that's full of unknowns and encumbrances versus the 4-lane superhighway that you can go faster than you ever would need to. One path, unencumbered, open. You move so fast you can't see the landscape around you, versus the one where each choice requires thought and awareness. And yes, you traverse it more quickly. The difference is those were choices that were actively made, and they drove reasoning to keep moving forward just because the road takes you somewhere.
I think that's what we see with Telltale, is increases the amount of expenses that they have. Is they were growing rapidly at first because they wanted to grow, but then what happened is they had to sustain that size and that scale in order to keep up with the expenses.
Well, and again, like having those other obstacles allows you the time to stop, regain those resources. You have to be more mindful of them. When you eventually drive on a road with no destination and no encumbrances, eventually you run out of fuel. Those kind of roads don't have gas stations usually on them. They don't have the ability to refuel. And what you find is that you end up being broken down and without any way of finding your way back to the proper path.
Right. And it's much harder to pivot when you're going 100 miles an hour down the road as opposed to going 35, 40. It gives you opportunity to, like you said, look around you, make the best call, and go in that direction.
Well, and I think that was what it comes down to, is knowing your why helps you when we all make that mistake sometimes where we go with what seems less hard and what seems like quicker dividends. But we need to know our why to find our true north, to get back on the path of least resistance, to challenge ourselves, to create an environment that allows that beast and baby to thrive.